In George Orwell's classic novel Animal Farm, a farm full of animals casts off their farmer, inspired by a vision of what the farm could be like if they ruled themselves. But what they discover over time is that sometimes the idea of what the farm could be is easier to hold on to than the actual practices that could make it so. Today I want to look at how that can happen in the church, how our faith can become an expression of what's in our heads to the exclusion of what we do with our hands, how we can become all head and no heart. Now the story that I want to look at this in is found in the book of Revelation. And that gives me a little bit of pause because Revelation is probably the most misunderstood and misapplied book in the entire Bible. And so I want to do a little bit of a dive into what Revelation is because I think it'll help us as we try and interpret some of the material found in the book. Our problem is that we often treat Revelation as if it's an appendix that's been attached to the back of our Bible. In case of rule of Antichrist, break glass and read. This way of reading Revelation has been popularized by books like the late great Planet Earth and the Left Behind series. But they ignore the fact that Revelation was written to a real audience of real people who lived 2,000 years ago, not in the modern era. When we read Revelation as history in advance, we misunderstand it. Instead, Revelation is supposed to be read as apocalypse. Oh, apocalypse? Apocalypse in this context doesn't mean the end of the world. The Greek word apocalypsis means revelation, which is where we get the name of the book. Apocalypse is a literary genre that was written by Jews from about 100 BC until 100 AD. That period of time was a time of intense persecution for the Jewish community. They were ruled by a series of foreign oppressors, and so they were trying to grapple with how God could allow bad things to happen to them. Apocalyptic literature is also born of a worldview that there are two realities. One reality, the physical world that we see with our own eyes, and beyond our perception, a spiritual reality, the heavenly realms, and that the events in the heavenly realms drive the events that happen in this physical world. So for example, we might see a reference to the beast attacking the church. And what that's really talking about is in the spiritual realm, this thing is happening, and then those under the sway of the demonic would persecute Christians. And that goes to a second point about apocalyptic literature. It's highly symbolic. Apocalyptic literature draws symbols from the Old Testament. And those symbols aren't meant as a description of what things look like, rather about their deeper meaning. So for example, in Revelation chapter 1, we see a picture of Jesus who has a double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Now, that's not meant to tell us that the risen Christ has this big piece of steel in his mouth. It's meant to help us understand the power of God's words and promises. And so we need not focus on visualizing what something looks like when it's described in Revelation, but to understand what the symbols mean and what that says about the nature of the thing being described. Revelation's also written in coded language. As I said before, the community that produced it was persecuted. And a lot of what it entails are predictions about God's judgment on their persecutors. Now, if you're writing about God's coming judgment on the people that rule over you, the last thing you want is them reading it and understanding that that's what you're saying. Since the imagery is drawn from the Old Testament, a person in the Jewish community who is well versed in the Old Testament would understand what all of this was about. But a casual observer who doesn't have a familiarity with the Old Testament scriptures would just find it gobbledygook, and that's kind of the point. But it's also the risk that we have when we interpret Revelation. If we are not familiar ourselves with Old Testament imagery, we can easily become completely lost in trying to interpret the book. So we need to go back to our roots in order to really appreciate what is going on in the book. Okay, that's my primer on apocalyptic literature. What about the book of Revelation specifically? Revelation is probably written at the last decade of the 1st century. So to put it in a little bit of context, Jesus is born probably about 4 BC. He's crucified and raised at about 30 AD. Now, from that period until the mid-60s, there's relative peace in the church. Yes, persecutions happen, but they happen sporadically and at a local level. But in AD 64, the crazed Roman Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for a fire that started in Rome, which he probably set himself. And from that moment until his death by suicide 4 years later, he persecutes the church savagely. People are killed simply because they are Christians. It becomes the official policy of the Roman Empire. But after that spasm of persecution, things settle down to something approaching normal. Now, fast forward a few decades to the 90s or the late 80s. And there's a new emperor named Domitian. And Domitian also persecutes the church. And Revelation is probably written during this persecution, but it looks backwards at the persecution under Nero and draws inspiration from that. If you're wondering, most scholars believe 666 is actually a reference to Nero. It looks at the past persecution of the church and sees that as a template or an archetype of the persecution that's happening in this present reality. Because it understands that the people like Nero and Domitian are mere pawns in a spiritual battle that's happening in the heavenly realms and that continues to repeat itself. And so the big theme of Revelation is looking back and seeing how God delivered his people from persecution, how he only allowed it to happen for a short period of time, and how even when it looked really bad, God was in control and was bringing it to an end and bringing the persecutor to judgment. So that's what's happening now. That Christians can bear up under the persecution that they're facing because they know that God is watching over them and that he's not going to allow this to go on forever. And so that's the big takeaway from the book of Revelation. If we read it in the history in advance way, then unless we find ourselves in the Great Tribulation, it doesn't have a lot of meaning to us. But if we read Revelation as a call to hold on to faithfulness in Jesus in hard times because Jesus is ultimately in control when things look like he isn't, then we can draw a lot of encouragement from Revelation. Now let's look at the letter itself. The letter is written to the church in Ephesus. Now the name Ephesus might feel familiar. There is a book in the New Testament, Ephesians, written to the church there, although it was probably written to a wider audience. We also see Ephesus pop up in Acts. Paul spends more time in Ephesus, about 3 years, than he does in any other place on his missionary journeys. Ephesus also is associated with the Apostle John and the Virgin Mary, who apparently relocate there after the time that Paul was there. Ephesians is a large and cosmopolitan city on the Aegean coast of what is modern Turkey. It has lots of different groups of people and lots of different expressions of religion. There's a large Jewish population, for example, but there's also a large pagan population. There's a temple in Ephesus to the pagan fertility goddess of Artemis. And so there's a lot of religious pilgrimage that happens in Ephesus as well. So the church in Ephesus is a church that is going to feel at odds with the place where they live. And that's important for us to understand as we look at what Jesus says to the church. So let's read the letter that Jesus dictates to John in Revelation chapter 2, 1-7. To the angel of the church of Ephesus write, "These are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, and walks among the 7 gold lampstands. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, and that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name, and have not grown weary. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you've fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place. But you have this in your favor. You hate the practices of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. So to summarize, Jesus is saying that the Ephesian church has done a really good job in making sure that they are discerning about what they believe. They have tested false teachers. They've been very particular about who they let to speak into their situation. They've endured persecution and hardship for Jesus, but apparently they have ceased to love. Now, some translations say you've forsaken your first love, and this seems to imply that you're saying that they don't love Jesus the way that they used to, that their ardor for him has cooled. But that's probably not what this means. After all, they are enduring persecution for Jesus. It's hard to see that they would do this if they've fallen out of love with him. Most translations now say the love you had at first, and the idea is that they've become so inwardly focused, so preoccupied with making sure that they guard their doctrinal boundaries, that their faith has merely become an intellectual faith that no longer works out in loving service to others inside the church or to others in their community. And Jesus is telling them that they are to be commended for holding on to their doctrine, but that their doctrine alone, without loving service to others, is incomplete. Now, it's not hard to see how a church that's in such difficulty, that's being persecuted and pressured to conform to a different way than the way that Jesus asked them to do, how they could become inwardly focused. When things become difficult, our tendency is to turn in on ourselves. Years ago, Carolyn and I went to a church that was just at the beginning of a very difficult time. We were invited to a prayer meeting, and we went, and all we prayed for the entire time was our church. The next time the meeting happened, we went back, and similarly, people just prayed for what was going on in our church. When I suggested that maybe we should pray for other things, not just what's inside of our church, I was told, no, this is just a prayer meeting for our church. Now, there's nothing wrong with praying for our church. We should probably all do more of that. But the issue here is that God sends Jesus into the world. That sending is something that he then passes on to us. As the Father has sent me, so I send you, Jesus tells his disciples. We have been sent to express God's unconditional love and his amazing grace to people outside the church. But when we become inwardly focused, we lose sight of this mission. And so we as the church can't simply be about what's going on in the church. We can't be isolated that way. We should be praying for the people in our community, for the politicians who make decisions. We should be praying for other churches. We should be praying for the church that's being persecuted out there. We should be praying for our own community and for its betterment. We cannot simply become about what is happening inside our community. To be Jesus' followers means that we have to concern ourselves with what is happening outside our community. There is something seductive about making our faith merely what goes on in here and not what has to happen with our hands. It saves us the difficult work of trying to figure out what love looks like in the messiness of human relationships. But while we need good doctrine that allows our faith to remain in our heads and never express itself in action, is incomplete. As James, Jesus' brother, so bluntly puts it, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by actions, is dead." So doctrine and love, which is expressed in service to others, ought to be inseparable. The Ephesians have spent so much of their energy guarding the doctrinal boundaries that they have lost the mission of Jesus. Jesus needs to be their example, and he needs to be our example. Jesus stood for right teaching. He corrected people's misunderstandings about God. He preached the good news of the kingdom. But Jesus also fed the poor. He healed the sick. He cast out demons. He proclaimed liberation for those who were excluded. And so, as his followers, we should be doing the same thing too. Now, our life circumstances are very different than the Ephesians. We don't suffer persecution, at least not in any way similar to them, not in some life and death struggle. But it's easy for us, like them, to fall victim to the idea of making Christian faith about believing the right things and not about serving and loving other people outside of ourselves. There certainly is lots of bad teaching that we need to confront. But if we spend all of our energies doing that, then we fail to follow the example of Jesus. Full-time navel-gazing isn't what we're called to do. What's more is as we spend more and more time defining ourselves against people that we see as people outside of the boundaries, the more time we say, well, I stand for this, and everybody who has a different view of it isn't part of my group. We place those people outside of God's grace. We give ourselves permission to not love them. We create boundaries that says everybody within these boundaries is people to whom I have an obligation to love. But if anybody finds themselves outside of these boundaries, then I don't need to love them. Is that the way that Jesus acted? How do we treat those with whom we have legitimate disagreements? Now, I'm a pacifist. I believe that Jesus tells us that we are not supposed to exercise violence on our enemies. And so I think it's unfitting for a person who calls themselves a follower of Jesus to take up a combat role in the armed forces. But if a person walks into our church who's a special forces infantryman, is it my job to say, I disagree with you? You are a person who needs to be corrected, you need to be put in your place, and I can treat you with contempt? Or do I set aside the difference that I have and say, I have an obligation to you, no matter where you find yourself, no matter what you do, to treat you with the same love that Jesus treated me with when I was a sinner and he died for me? And so we must never fall to the temptation to erect boundaries that allow us to exclude other people from God's grace and from our obligation to love. Unfortunately, I see this kind of thing happening all the time. Every time I go on Facebook, I see people who identify as Christians name-calling other people, saying terrible things about them because they don't agree with what they believe. Is this the way that Jesus acted? People might point out the fact that Jesus can be quite harsh with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the teachers of the law. And indeed, Jesus can be harsh. But when Jesus is harsh, his harshness is always a result of his love. Jesus confronts bad doctrine when that bad doctrine is actively hurting other people. So, for example, the tabernacle and later the temple was supposed to be a place where everyone could come and meet with God, a place where everyone was on equal footing and all could find relationship with God and with each other and grace and forgiveness. But by the time that Jesus came, the temple had become a source of power and exclusion. Certain people had power because the temple, their position in the temple, gave them access to God. And they used that power not to bless other people, but to exclude them from the religious life of Israel. And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees were able to get close to God, at least in their own thinking, and they were able to exclude all those who they thought were beneath them. And so when Jesus rails against people like that, he's angry because those people are keeping so many people who might come to God away from God. He's not making fun of people or calling them out or calling them names because he wants to feel like he's morally superior to them or because he wants to signal to the people who are on his tribe that he is taking the right stand on some issue. Jesus is trying to confront the hypocrisy that is ruining lives because he loves the people whose lives are being ruined. So Jesus' example calls us to strike a balance. On one hand, we can't simply give up on the central teachings of the Christian faith. We can't compromise on the fact that it is Jesus who is Lord. There are going to be times when we feel pressured to do just that. And we need to stand and say, no, this is the center of who we are and what we believe. At the same time, when that stubbornness elicits a response of hostility from other people, we have to choose how we're going to respond to their response. When people hate us because we stand for Jesus, and then we turn and hate them, then we erase whatever witness we have of who Jesus is. Jesus, after all, is the one who prayed that God would have mercy on the people who were orchestrating his murder. On the cross, Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He loves everyone, even the people who hate him, who are killing him. And in the same way, when we are the victims of hostility because of our witness of Jesus, we have an opportunity. If we respond to that hostility with loving service, then the suffering life of Jesus lives through us, and they will see Jesus. But if we choose to respond in pettiness, in hostility towards their hostility, no one's going to see Jesus anywhere.